the fun portion of the webinar. So, the National Down Syndrome Society is the leading human rights organization for all individuals with Down syndrome. And we're excited to envision a world in which all people with Down syndrome have the opportunity to enhance their quality of life, realize their life aspirations, and become valued members of welcoming communities. So the reason why we advocate is because disability rights are human rights, and we are excited that our mission is almost a year old now, and we advocate for the human rights of all individuals with Down syndrome. So we advocate so that they can live a long, healthy life, so they are allowed to learn, work, save, earn, and become independent. So NDSS has 4 major programmatic areas. The first is our National Advocacy and Policy Center, which is located in Washington, D.C. This center creates systematic change through legislative advocacy, both at the local and federal levels. We also have, which we're all here to learn more about, our National Inclusive Health and Sport Program, which my colleague Michelle will tell you a little bit more about in a moment. We have our community outreach programs, which provide comprehensive and accurate information and resources to the Down syndrome community. And this new caregiver guidebook is one of those great resources that we share with the medical community, the caregiver community, family members, and individuals with Down syndrome. And finally, we have our public awareness initiatives that bring new and positive representations of people with Down syndrome to the general public. One of our most well-known public awareness campaigns is our DS Works campaign, in which we encourage all businesses from Main Street to Wall Street to hire individuals with Down syndrome. And with that being said, I am going to turn it over to my fantastic colleague, Michelle Ray, who is the director of the Inclusive Health and Sport Program, to tell you a little bit more about what she does.
Great. Thank you, Colleen. Colleen, I'm not sure I see the slides moving, but it just might be on my end. So I'm just going to start by talking to the slide, Health is Exercising Your Human Right.
Do you see it now, Michelle? Sorry.
So I'm excited to... Oh, it's okay. I'm excited to join today, and I'm thrilled we have our resident expert, Dr. Julie Moran, on the webinar to present our new Caregivers Guide, and Julie will go immediately following me. And before we turn it over to Julie, I want to share with our participants a new program area which we recently formed here at NDSS, and Colleen, you touched on it just a few minutes ago. Our newest program area is the National Inclusive Health and Sports, and the significance of this program is health, as we believe health is a very important and basic human right, and it complements our mission statement of being the leading human rights organization for individuals with Down syndrome. There are 3 main components of the Inclusive Health and Sports program, including our National Buddy Walk program, Team NDSS, and our Healthy Community. Many of you are probably familiar with our National Buddy Walk program and probably already participate in a local Buddy Walk. It's the largest peer-to-peer fundraising and awareness campaign in the Down syndrome community. We have over 225 Buddy Walk locations across the country and have already expanded internationally. Last year, we had over 330,000 individuals participating in a Buddy Walk, and we raised over $14.2 million, with 97% of those funds staying in local communities. If you haven't had a chance to participate in a Buddy Walk, we encourage you to find one by going to our NDSS website and locating one on a map. Team NDSS is a new program in 2017, and that includes our Athlete Ambassador program, our charity racing teams, as well as special events. This year we have over 100 athlete ambassadors who train and race in sports such as running, triathlon, cycling, and other sports to spread awareness and show support for the Down syndrome community. NDSS was an official charity partner in the New York City Marathon, the Run Disney Walt Disney World Marathon, which is coming up in January, and we had teams at the Philadelphia Love Run and Marine Corps Marathon, and we'll be expanding these charity racing teams in 2018. And finally, our Healthy Community is a new initiative that you will hear a lot more about in 2018. Our Healthy Community focuses on health and wellness for individuals with Down syndrome and their families. And our webinar today is part of this new Our Healthy Community initiative. And you can learn more about all of these programs, again, by visiting our website or contacting a staff member at NDSS. Colleen, I'm just going to skip through the next slide and go on to an event that we want to make you aware of that's taking place. It's a national event that NDSS is holding on March 21st, so this coming March, to celebrate World Down Syndrome Day. This event is part of our Inclusive Health and Sports program, and it's available to anyone across the country. There's no age requirement, no age limit at all. Racing for 321 is, again, on World Down Syndrome Day, and it's a virtual event that you and your family can do anytime, any place, and as we like to say, at any pace on March 21st. We encourage you to run, walk, hike, bike, swim, or just move 3.21 miles on March 21st. It's free, and registration is open by visiting our website. And we certainly encourage everyone on this webinar, as well as everyone in your community, to join us in celebrating World Down Syndrome Day. So I'll turn it back to today's topic, which is our new Caregivers Guide. NDSS believes in the importance of caregivers and that they should not be underestimated. We're happy to celebrate this month, November, as National Caregivers Month, and have released our newest guide as part of our Healthy Community and our community outreach programs. We're proud to provide resources about a variety of topics across the lifespan of individuals with Down syndrome, including Alzheimer's disease. Our newest guide, Alzheimer's disease and Down syndrome, is a practical guidebook for caregivers, family members, and really the community. And this important guide is a collaborative effort of the National Down Syndrome Society, the National Task Group on Intellectual Disabilities and Dementia Practices, known as NTG, and the Alzheimer's Association. So Colleen, I'll turn it back over to you to introduce Dr. Julie Moran.
Hi, everybody, again. We are so excited that Dr. Julie Moran from Massachusetts is able to join us on today's webinar to give a quick overview of what the practical guidebook for caregivers is. Dr. Julie Moran has been extremely involved in this book from the beginning, and from myself and the rest of the NDSS staff and from the Down syndrome community, we can't thank her enough for her support in bringing this guidebook to life, as well as the rest of the researchers she worked with. And with that being said, Julie, I'm going to turn it over for you to talk a little bit more about who you worked with on the book and then the contents of the book.
Sure. Well, thanks, Colleen, and thank you to all of the listeners who took time out of today to learn about this important topic that's extremely near and dear to my heart, and definitely near and dear to the hearts of the leadership of the National Down Syndrome Society and also the collaborators who worked pretty tirelessly on this project for almost 2 years in the making. So thank you for listening in on this webinar. I'd like to start by just thanking the collaborating authors on this project. They're listed on the screen that you see ahead of you. My co-writers of the writing group is Mary Hogan, Kathy Sursick-Storer, Kathy Service, and Joan Earlhahn. And then collaborating with us from the two organizations that Colleen mentioned before, the National Task Group and the National Alzheimer's Association. That's Sam Fazio and Beth Kellmeyer from the Alzheimer's Association, and Matthew Janicki and Seth Keller from the NTG. I'd also like to extend a special thanks to Colleen Hatcher, who's been coordinating this project, and also to her predecessor in leading this project, Vanessa Quick, who helped get this off the ground originally, and also, of course, to Sarah Weir, who's the president and CEO of NDSS. Thank you so much for your support of this project and for understanding the big gap that still remains out there in terms of good, practical, fact-based information that's available to caregivers and other lay professionals and other family members, et cetera, to provide this information on Alzheimer's disease with adults with Down syndrome. So thank you to everybody. My goal for today is really to provide an overview of the book. This topic is pretty dense and something that I usually would lecture on for, between an hour and a half and 2 hours, and that's not necessarily the purpose of today's webinar, but really to introduce you to this resource. And so I'm very grateful and excited that there's actually a resource that I can be referring you all to where you can refresh yourself on these topics. So what I would envision today's webinar to be is really a tour guide through the book itself, highlighting some key aspects of how we structured the book and how we kind of wanted to make it useful to people at all stages of curiosity and seeking knowledge and guidance and education around this topic. So I thought I would start with that. And I'll say that also as an introduction to the way some of the slides might present. The goal is really not for you to absorb all the text on the slide, but really just to see it as your tour guide through the book and know that all of that information is really clipped and highlighted from the book itself. And there will be ample opportunity once you download or order the guide to be able to review it again and again. And that's really the main goal. So we started similarly, I'm sorry, Colleen, if you could go back one. That was my own personal goal of that webinar, but then the goals of the book itself is really just highlighting that to provide proactive and practical guidance to people who are noticing possible changes that might raise a suspicion of Alzheimer's disease or start to spark some concerns about possible memory changes, really to empower families with practical and directly applicable knowledge. For people who are already in the midst of an Alzheimer's disease diagnosis and are providing direct care or ongoing care to a loved one with Down syndrome and Alzheimer's disease, to really provide that kind of both encouragement and support and guidance about how to make it through the lifespan of Alzheimer's disease and how to really enhance the care that's provided on a daily basis. And then really throughout the whole mission of the book is to highlight the importance of honoring the essence of the person with Down syndrome. And I think that really gets back to the way this webinar started off, talking about health is a human right. And so I think about this book in terms of dovetailing with that mission, that when we talk about issues related to memory loss or the concern about Alzheimer's disease and Down syndrome, one of the most basic rights that I feel very passionately about is the right to an accurate diagnosis. And I think that's often a hit or miss experience for some people. And so this guidebook is also helping kind of bolster the knowledge of people who might be on their journey looking for answers about whether or not there might be memory issues evolving, to help empower people to know how to advocate for an accurate diagnosis and how to look further. You can go to the next slide now. Thanks, Colleen. So we started really with thinking about broad principles about maintaining person-centered and relationship-centered care. And this, as you can see in this call-out box, is a section that's highlighted in the book, but really just talking about a lot of core values that are not entirely unique to how you would care for somebody with Alzheimer's disease specifically. I mean, it's really the kinds of care that anybody in an ideal world would probably hope for themselves, but it's just another opportunity for us to re-emphasize this important aspect of maintaining these core principles when caring for somebody with a memory disorder, or caring for somebody with Alzheimer's disease throughout their lifetime. Okay, next slide. So we start out really by talking about what is Alzheimer's disease. And again, this is something that goes into more detail in the book, but really just talking about dementia being an overall descriptive term of a whole host of diagnoses, of which Alzheimer's disease is the most common cause of dementia. And certainly relative to adults with Down syndrome, it's the specific memory disease that we are most concerned about for adults with Down syndrome. The main thing to highlight is really the core definition of Alzheimer's disease and core definition of a dementia in general, is that it affects memory, thinking, function, and behavior in a way that represents a decline from the individual's long-standing level of ability. And that's something that's highlighted and bolded there because that's a really important point, especially when we're thinking about adults with Down syndrome, or really anybody with any form of intellectual disability, is that that very definition of understanding what somebody's longstanding level of ability is something that's entirely unique to each person. And so you can't wrap any assumptions into that unless you ask good and thorough questions to understand what the individual was able to achieve throughout their lifetime. And we'll circle back to that when we talk about getting an accurate diagnosis, but that part I'd like for that concept to really start to permeate throughout this whole framework of understanding accuracy and how to assess changes. So through collaboration with the Alzheimer's Association, we also wanted to provide some duplication in some ways of ways that things have been conceptualized through the Alzheimer's Association resources as well. So they actually put out a great 10 warning signs brochure and really highlight the 10 warning signs for the general population to look for anything related to the development of Alzheimer's disease. And these are all really broadly applicable to adults with Down syndrome too. So we created some different examples perhaps in the book that were more specific to how this might unfold for somebody with an intellectual disability. But the core 10 warning signs do still translate quite well to adults with Down syndrome as well. And those are all outlined there as a way of looking for any new changes that might be coming up. Next slide. And then, of course, the connection. What is the specific connection between Down syndrome and Alzheimer's disease? And this we go into a bit more detail in the book, but just as a general overview, the reason that adults with Down syndrome are spoken about as an entirely separate and unique category when we think about dementia risk specifically is really traced back to the 3 copies of chromosome 21 that adults with Down syndrome carry. Chromosome 21 carries the gene that codes for a protein that's laid down in excess in people who develop Alzheimer's disease. And so it's felt like that this predisposition, as well as some other factors related to chromosome 21 that contribute to the phenomenon of accelerated aging, all contribute to the risk that's elevated at premature levels in adults with Down syndrome as they grow older. The thing to really highlight, though, in conjunction with this statement is that this is not an inevitability or a clinical inevitability, meaning that it's not just a matter of living long enough that all adults would develop Alzheimer's disease specifically. And again, this is something that still is carried out there as an assumption for some people, or might have even been carried forward from other health professionals who might have had their facts based in some older research or some older teaching. And this is the other reason to be extra careful about assessing change as things start to emerge, or any other changes might occur when somebody's entering into their late 40s, 50s, 60s and beyond, is to be really careful about what that might represent and to not race ahead and prematurely assume that this is the emergence of Alzheimer's disease. Current estimates really are, these are ballpark estimates, but just for teaching purposes, I usually use the statistics of prevalence of 30% of people with Down syndrome in their 50s and 50% or more individuals with each increasing year of life in their 60s with increased risk of Alzheimer's disease. So certainly the risk is quite real, but again, we're not quoting numbers anywhere near 100%. So it's really important to be careful as we approach this topic. Next slide. So there's a section that follows that in the book about thinking about other things that could be related to changes if we experience change as we grow older. And this gives me a chance to highlight the earlier publication that we did with the National Down Syndrome Society that came out in 2013 called Aging in Down Syndrome. And I encourage, if you've not looked at that yet, to please go check that out as well, because that covers really nicely all topics related to just general health and aging for adults with Down syndrome. But because it's such important and pertinent information, it's reiterated here too about common and prevalent conditions that adults with Down syndrome are at higher risk of developing as they grow older. And the reason that it's so relative to the discussion of Alzheimer's disease is because many of these common conditions are fairly easily screened for, certainly things that we need to be asking about and thinking about. And many of them, if they're undetected or unrecognized, can also carry symptoms that can masquerade as memory loss or confusion or a loss of function. So before anyone goes racing ahead to making an assumption about why changes are taking place, it's really important to be aware of many of these other common conditions that might be out there kind of smoldering in the background and without being identified could be playing a very key and contributory role to what's going on. Next slide. So again, this is also something that is important to emphasize, again, dovetailing with what Michelle's work is so importantly addressing, is just really talking about the importance of maintaining good health throughout our entire lifetime. And this is really meant for not only folks who are entering adulthood with Down syndrome, and certainly very relevant to adults who, or caregivers who might be reading this book who are taking care of somebody with Alzheimer's disease, thinking about the importance of healthy habits and good habits that support healthy brain and body functioning as so important to being able to, number one, for people who are young and healthy, to increase their or lower their risk factors for any aspects that might be affecting their cerebrovascular health, so the health of their brain circulation and their overall well-being, but then also for people who may have the diagnosis, that these factors are really important too in terms of maintaining health and lowering additional risk. Go to the next slide, please. So the importance of an accurate diagnosis, this is a heading taken directly from the book. This is something that's really highlighted well in the book and that we spend some time in. I've touched on this before, but really talking about how understanding each individual and the changes specifically that they're experiencing is an important way of, an important inroads to discussing the diagnosis itself. So really starting with highlighting the fact that dementia is really a clinical diagnosis, and that what that means essentially is that it's based on the conversation that you have with a health professional who's looking for signs and symptoms that are very suggestive of the development of a dementia, and then doing due diligence to rule out all other potential conditions that could be contributing to the changes that are being seen. So there's really no one single diagnostic blood test or scan. All the information that's gathered is really helping to support a diagnosis, but the real basis of a diagnosis comes down to the history and the story that's being told and being able to draw out all elements of that story in a careful and concise way. So that for some people, you know, like myself, who does this work all the time, and this is, you know, my area of specialty, that is something that I do on a regular basis. For other people who might be bringing this question originally to somebody in the, you know, in their general practitioner or primary care doctor, there's information in this book that helps you supply the information that can lay out the story a bit more clearly and concisely to help the decision-making process. Next slide. So excuse me, this goes hand in hand with understanding this concept of a baseline assessment. And what that means is what I've alluded to is that each individual with Down syndrome, each individual with any form of an intellectual disability is unique in and of themselves. And that's true for every person, but in terms of making any assumptions about what some individual might be able to have achieved throughout their lifetime, there's a wide variance. And that's something that we've highlighted in this. You can see in this the third paragraph there, that some people have achieved some high-level academic skills and are voracious readers and are independently employed, and other individuals throughout their lifetime may have never learned to tie their own shoelaces or use the bathroom without assistance. So understanding where each individual has started from in life helps give us a much better understanding of how we're interpreting and assessing changes that we might be seeing in adulthood in one's 40s, 50s, 60s, and beyond. But really, we have no roadmap to assess that unless we have a good understanding of where an individual started from in life and the level they were able to rise to throughout adulthood in terms of their independence and their functioning. And because there's a highlighted section at the end of that third paragraph too that says recognition of a progressive change from baseline abilities is the cornerstone of an Alzheimer's disease diagnosis. And so when we're thinking about making a diagnosis, this is such a critical part of understanding what may or may not be going on. And this is something where For those people listening on this webinar who are, family members or caregivers who've known an individual for a long time, this is where your expertise really comes into play in understanding and picking up changes that say, this is something they used to be able to do and they cannot do it anymore, and I'm concerned. That is something that we really help our healthcare providers tremendously by being able to highlight those aspects. Next slide. Also, for thoroughness, in addition to understanding a baseline assessment from a descriptive standpoint about abilities, is also thinking about other new changes that might be coming up when we are concerned about memory specifically. So these symptoms or other features are things that just an important checklist for a caregiver to think about when seeking an assessment. Is there any other new changes arising in hearing or vision or dental issues? Have we witnessed any seizure activity? This is sort of a checklist of things to highlight to a healthcare professional when thinking about describing changes. These would be important new findings or any worsening of these findings to really highlight to them. So this also would help point us in different directions about what to look for. Okay, next slide. So seeking an assessment, again, the book is really structured to help prepare a caregiver to go and seek an assessment and be prepared with that information. And then also going through other important things to highlight when you're seeing a healthcare professional for this type of a review, highlighting the importance of reviewing medications, which, just a phenomenon that's seen for many adults as they grow older is acquiring more medications, more specialists who may be prescribing medications, and making sure that we're really thoroughly looking through a medication list, looking for looking at all other underlying factors, thinking about what's in the medication list that we could be improving, hearing the story in real detail, and then making sure that we're making an informed move forward towards either excluding or including that diagnosis as a possibility, and making sure that also we are being carefully moving towards a diagnosis, and that we follow the appropriate channels to rule out other underlying possibilities or treat other underlying possibilities before moving ahead to considering Alzheimer's disease as a final diagnosis. Next slide. So I called the next section is titled Now What? And I think that's really an important question that really seems to follow after all of the hard work is done to finally arrive at a diagnosis. And that is a really important aspect to cover regardless. But really the now what of the discussion is an entirely new clean slate of a whole new discussion to be building after achieving that diagnosis. Once we have arrived on a diagnosis of Alzheimer's disease, if that is indeed present, there's so much more that needs to be done in terms of counseling and preparing and really supporting a caregiver and a set of caregivers, if that's the case, for what lies ahead. And so I think this is actually the part where this book is so meaningful in terms of its availability to the public, because the now what of the discussion is something that often is not something that in a typical medical encounter, there's usually not a lot of time to be doing, a couple of hours worth of counseling about this, or really being able to give really comprehensive guidance about each aspect of things that an individual caregiver needs to think about. And each individual caregiver and each individual patient has their own set of concerns and has their own set of environmental concerns within their home, or thinking about the caregiving situation in general. So this section helps try and cover most bases that we would need to be thinking about from a diagnosis forward. Next slide. So just in terms of talking about the trajectory of Alzheimer's disease is a progressive disease with incremental decline noted over time. And so it's broken sort of arbitrarily into 3 stages. I say arbitrarily, meaning that not everybody comes with one pure cluster of symptoms, but there's a general framework of how things progress that helps us make a good estimate about whether or not their features are most consistent with the early stage of Alzheimer's disease, mid-stage, or late-stage features. And so this is included in the book just to help people read ahead and think about what lies ahead in terms of changes to expect for the future and what's consistent with where the individual is at now. Next slide. The other components then, we cover physical complications of Alzheimer's disease, and this is really pertinent to caregivers on a day-to-day basis about things to look for that could be complicating an individual's health, general physical health, as dementia progresses. So as Alzheimer's disease progresses, we are at increased risk of developing swallowing dysfunction and eating difficulties. So there's sections here that are devoted to highlighting some knowledge around that and to look for that. And then also wanted to provide some very practical guidance about other tips to use or strategies to use to help enhance safe swallowing and to make eating more easy for individuals with dementia as they grow older. Incontinence, so loss of control over bowel and bladder, is also something that might be seen as we develop Alzheimer's disease and progress. And so there's also some caregiver strategies to help with that as well, and also just to highlight the importance of looking out for incontinence changes. Next slide. We cover topics related to seizures because adults with Down syndrome who develop Alzheimer's disease are at increased risk of developing seizure activity. This is not something that's guaranteed for people with dementia as they grow older, but certainly something that's at higher risk and can be really startling for caregivers if they are not prepared to at least know that there's risk and to look for some of the warning signs. So we try to highlight that for caregivers so they feel prepared or at least educated about that possibility and know that to take any concerns seriously and bring it forward to a healthcare professional. And then also talking about the progressive loss of walking and the risk for falls, very important to safety for both the individual and for caregivers. So talking about strategies also to help improve safe walking within the environment and other tips of what to look for to create safety around any walking concerns. You can go to the next slide. So we talk about also the importance of maintaining medical stability throughout the trajectory of Alzheimer's disease. So when an individual develops Alzheimer's disease, it becomes even more important to try and stay as medically healthy and well as possible because adults with Alzheimer's disease are generally more vulnerable to setbacks, both from a mental status standpoint and a physical functional status standpoint. If they develop even a minor illness, there could be more of a difficulty sort of rallying back to their original baseline when they're recovering from an illness. So this is just, some of this stuff is really, you know, when I highlight this to caregivers, I often say this is just common sense stuff, but it really becomes so much more important in terms of things to look out for adults in keeping them safe and avoiding any preventable setbacks. So especially now as we're having this conversation in late November, thinking about, you know, getting the flu vaccine, staying away from people who are ill, getting regular checkups, keeping up with adequate nutrition and hydration, etc. And then also it gave us a good chance to then highlight a note about sudden changes and just talking about how the very nature of Alzheimer's disease as it progresses is typically a slow and incremental decline that we see over time. So a really important thing to educate caregivers about is being on the lookout for anything that seems sudden or abrupt, because that is not something that's expected for people with Alzheimer's disease typically. And often that means that something, you know, acutely worrisome is going on. Either we became very gravely ill, or maybe something happened with medications, but just really to, you know, carve that feature out as something that's atypical for the natural progression of Alzheimer's disease, and to let caregivers know that if something seems abruptly different overnight, that is really something to pay attention to and highlight to a medical professional so that we could be looking for other root causes of what's going on. Next slide. We then pivot to a section that's really about caregiving principles in general. The core treatment for Alzheimer's disease right now is really supportive. That makes up the mainstay of how we treat adults with how we treat all adults with Alzheimer's disease. There's a little bit of information that's included in the book about the fact that there are some medications for dementia, but really that was not the core focus of this book in any way, to provide that kind of direct medical information, but really to highlight the fact that the crux of treatment for Alzheimer's disease is supportive through consistent structure and good caregiver support, providing an environment that's safe and well supported. And so the large remainder of the book is devoted to how to provide caregiving that's appropriate for an adult with dementia, and then also thinking on the flip side, how to support a caregiver throughout the trajectory of Alzheimer's disease. Next slide. So we start with some practical principles, just thinking about just some general sort of guidelines about how to think about caring for oneself in the caregiver role and how that translates into good care for an individual. Thinking about some general principles to return to, like trying to find emotional connection, be kind to yourself, maintaining healthy relationships for both the individual and for yourself. These are just nice things to kind of refresh on a regular basis as a way of just providing good care for an individual and providing good self-care to yourself as a caregiver. Next slide. This again is also just a screenshot from the book itself, but just to talk about how caregivers can be taught how to structure a day that feels comfortable and manageable for somebody with Alzheimer's disease. For somebody with memory problems, providing more structure, predictability, safety, and security throughout the day can be very helpful in reorienting an individual and helping reduce the sense of anxiety from not knowing what's coming next. So there's some nice information here that also outlines how to, some general principles about how to think about planning for a day, and other general principles about how to approach structuring a day and how to approach an individual. So this is also with some help from the Alzheimer's disease resources. This table is credit to them. Same with the next one, thanks Colleen, is also just an example of a daily plan about how to structure a day that feels manageable, but also has some good, stimulating activities, things that are pleasurable, allowing some time for resting, etc. So this is just an example, but again, our gratitude to the Alzheimer's Association for already doing so much good work out there for Alzheimer's disease resources in general, and just with their good example, we helped adapt a lot of especially the tools and the tables, because they've already did such a nice job that we felt many of those things were really very applicable to adults with Down syndrome as well. Next slide. Communication is a really key issue for people with Alzheimer's disease, thinking about how to adapt communication so that it's dementia friendly and that we learn to speak the language of Alzheimer's disease. Many caregivers find themselves frustrated because communication doesn't work the way it used to once memory problems come in. So we really wanted to highlight some very practical tips about how to adapt your language, how to adapt your frame of mind when connecting and attempting to connect with somebody with Alzheimer's disease. And so these were we tried to sort of bullet it out in the most practical and easily digestible format possible. Next slide. This also dovetails with some adaptive strategies because, there's many caregivers who do encounter certain stumbling blocks with trying to communicate with somebody with Alzheimer's disease and might find themselves very frustrated if they keep running around the same circle or not getting the response that they're looking for. So just thinking about that in a proactive way, we use some examples to avoid those common pitfalls so that there could be more successful communication for both the caregiver and for the individual, and leading to some more successful and meaningful connections for everybody, which makes the caregiving role much more satisfying and helps avoid some symptoms of fatigue and burnout at the end of the day. Next slide. Behaviors are also a very recurring concern for people as they grow older with Alzheimer's disease. Some individuals might not exhibit behaviors at all, but it's a very common concern for caregivers if they are encountering behaviors, any type of range of behaviors, refusals to participate in care or any kind of yelling or acting out, whatever it might be. So this could be a really distressing time for everybody involved. So, we are not able to address every form of behavior in general, but talking about a different framework of how to approach common behaviors and really try to drill down for any root causes and thinking about different ways that we can adapt either our communication style or our environment or time of day, different types of trial and error to see if we could help alleviate any sources of agitation or irritability. Next slide. And then talking about things that are very common culprits that could be driving some negative or distressing behavior. So, behavior is usually felt to be some form of communication that, a behavioral outburst or some sort of distressing behavior that we might engage in, thinking about something that what is trying to be communicated at the root of all that. So thinking about pain or sources of pain, or if the environment's overstimulating, or if we feel scared in a new and unfamiliar surrounding, or encountering lots of frustration by doing things that we simply can't do well anymore and just experiencing escalating frustration from that. So trying to help the caregivers thinking about different ways that they could be either adapting a daily plan or thinking about avoiding certain triggering areas to help alleviate some of those escalating behaviors if they're coming up. Next slide. We also really wanted to strongly emphasize care for the caregiver. One thing that's absolutely true for caring for adults with Alzheimer's disease is that care for an individual with Alzheimer's disease is absolutely dependent on the health and well-being of the caregiver, because the treatment is so caregiver dependent that we want to make sure that there's equal time and attention paid to both sides of the caregiving dynamic, both the person receiving the care and making sure that it's not at the expense of the health and well-being of the person providing the care. So really emphasizing and encouraging caregivers to acknowledge that, to hopefully avoid reaching a point where they just feel burnt out or exhausted, and finding ways to replenish themselves and take good care of themselves so that they too can continue in that role in a way that feels meaningful. Next slide. And then thinking about, also relevant to the caregiver, him or herself, or the caregiving team, is just thinking about the future and how to think proactively about different encounters that we might, or different crossroads that we might encounter as Alzheimer's disease progresses, and thinking proactively about those things so that we don't encounter certain predictable crossroads and feel unprepared or that we had not planned or anticipated certain things. And this, of course, can extend in many different directions, both for sustainability of the caregiving arrangement itself or the living situation, but just really highlighting the importance of, whatever the circumstances might be, thinking proactively and utilizing resources to help plan ahead. Next slide. And this too also is highlighting planning for the future, and then thinking about Alzheimer's disease in its late stages, and considering issues related to end of life. And this is really woven throughout the book in terms of proactive planning and thinking ahead to end of life, but then certainly helping think about it in real time too. Colleen, if you do next slide. Just talking about other resources related to any adaptations of goals of care, talking about resources such as palliative care and hospice, and then covering issues related to bereavement and grief, and the importance of honoring the individual throughout the entire lifespan and making sure that we're taking care of ourselves in the process. the conclusion of the book, you can go ahead and do that one. The conclusion of the book really helps highlight this one paragraph, which I will read because I think it's important that the collaborators of the book really do express our deep gratitude to the people with Down syndrome, families, caregivers, and peers for truly being our greatest teachers. Your wisdom and experience forms an important legacy, and we do sincerely thank you. So much of this book has been contributed to by the shared wisdom and expertise of people who either have a personal experience with Down syndrome and Alzheimer's disease through their family, or then, such as myself, through my professional work with individuals with Down syndrome and questions related to memory changes. And so much of that has been poured into this book. And we really sincerely thank everybody who's been involved in this effort, and hope so much that this book goes forward and helps many people. Thank you so much for the opportunity.
Great, and thank you so much, Dr. Julie Moran, for really making sure that this book comes to life and explaining it all so beautifully on this webinar today. So while we are waiting over the next couple of minutes, it looks like we have about 12 minutes to answer any questions or comments that anyone wants to ask, either to Michelle about NDSS's Inclusive Health and Sport programs, or Julie about the new caregiver guide. You can ask them right in your sidebar, and we will answer them to the best of our ability. And if you can't think of anything at the time, but you take this home and you share it with family and friends, then you can always email NDSS for any questions, and we will get those answered. So if anyone has any questions, just please let us know. Oh, perfect. Hi, how can we get a copy of this booklet is a question that we received. I can answer that question, Linda. So NDSS has the booklet live on our website. It's under about Down syndrome and then publications. And at that time, you can also request up to 10 copies of printed booklets that we will mail and ship to you just around the turn of the new year. And we also do have a list of medical professionals who specialize in Down syndrome and Alzheimer's on our website. And if you have any further questions about that, you can reach out to us at NDSS. Yes, Jesse, we will email the slides to you. I'm sorry about the slides not progressing. That's my fault. I'm so sorry. And I think those are all the questions we have so far. So if anyone has any further questions, in the meantime, I will repeat that this is available on ndss.org under About Down Syndrome, and then underneath the Publications tab. Again, it's available online for you to download as a PDF for you to share with family members, friends, medical professionals that you work with in regards to Alzheimer's and Down syndrome. And we will be mailing printed copies around the turn of the new year. So you will receive up to 10 free printed copies by January 15th. Does anyone have any further questions for Michelle or for Julie? Okay, perfect. It looks like no further questions. So Michelle and Julie, you're off the hook from answering any questions. But again, just as a reminder, you can email info@ndss.org or call NDSS at 800-221-4602 at any time for us to help you answer any questions that you have about our Inclusive Health and Sport programs, our new guidebook for caregivers, or any other information that we have on our website. Please give us a call or shoot us an email. And everyone have a wonderful day. Thank you so much to Michelle and Julie for helping us with this process and making this webinar happen. And we look forward to continuing the work of bettering the Down syndrome community through health.
Thank you, Colleen. Thanks, everyone.
Thanks, Colleen.
Bye.
Thank you, Julie.
Bye.